how did you get introduced to the end of life or death doula training, and what inspired you?
And I started to pursue my master's in spiritual psychology. There's a lot of talk about death and dying in there. And that pursuit was really to try to just widen my own aperture on what I knew to be this concept of what matters or what's spiritual or who is our God. The more I thought about it, the more and more I realized, like I sort of looked back and realized just how I realized there was so much I just didn't know at the time. And so I can't remember how it came to be, but I really took an interest in this idea of, that dichotomy between being a birth doula versus a death doula, and knowing that it all comes full circle anyway for us at the end of our life.
Welcome to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. If you ever asked, how do I protect myself and those I love if something unexpected happened to me? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Niki Weiss, and together we'll explore how to protect yourself in a world where both your physical and digital legacy leave a lasting impact. And welcome back to another episode of the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. And today my guest is Christopher Robbins. Now, Chris, this is the first time we're actually meeting and speaking with each other, but we made the connection through a very dear friend of mine who participated in your men's retreat called Soul Degree. If you can just share with us the opportunity that people have with Soul Degree, and then what got you involved as a death doula as part of that business plan.
Well, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. Soul Degree, in its most basic description, is a program designed for men that anchors on a 5-day wilderness retreat, but takes place over 4 or 5 months, always with a dozen men in some remote part of the world, mostly domestic so far, although that is changing. This is something that I created out of necessity almost a decade ago when I was in a really dark hole of my own, and managed to put together the parts and pieces of a program that was missing for me in my life. Some of that was, I guess you'd call it nature therapy. Some of it was just tapping back into boyhood roots, getting muddy, laughing and stoking fires. And then there was a real piece of it that involved needing male perspective in particular. I have always been somebody who loves watching the game, but would rather not talk about the score, and finds a lot more teeth in having a conversation about the things that really matter. That was the essence of Soul Degree, to create space for guys to be able to step out of what is normally a pretty frenetic, paced, do, whatever it might be, earn, or like all the things that, and no disrespect to women, but I think us guys can find ourselves inadvertently pre-programmed to think that this is our job, to just get up and serve the needs of anybody or everyone around us. Certainly for myself, it landed me in after many years just trying to honestly be somebody that I wasn't, left me in a dark spot. So Soul Degree was this thing that I curated alongside a few friends and turned it into what was an outlet for my own mental health at the time, but honestly still to this day is the reason why it remains pretty intimate and small batch. I only host a few of these programs a year so that I can be a part of it and roll up my sleeves and bring my own life and my own pain and struggle to the fire, so to speak. If I were to do more of that, I think it would maybe defeat the purpose of why I'm in it to begin with. It's been super special. I've really, over the years, not only gotten a lot out of it for myself, but been completely blown away by some of the similarities that I see in men, but also some of the transformation that has occurred right before my eyes.
I want to correct myself when I introduced you already is I used the word business plan with the word when I was describing death doula. I want to edit myself and say stepping into the death doula space as personal development is really a calling. I learned that you were a death doula because Jeff told me that part of his attraction to your program was Jeff himself is going through end of life with his father. And he felt very drawn to Soul Degree because you touched so deeply into those aspects of not just for the living, but also the letting go or the dying process. So how did you get introduced to the end of life or death doula training, and what inspired you?
I think that when I think about what ultimately brought me to Soul Degree, it had a lot to do with the loss of my father almost 20 years ago. I was in my 40s, just getting started in a new restaurant venture. He was diagnosed with esophageal cancer and had a tumor removed, but surgery didn't go great, and he took him 18 months or so before he passed away. We had a good communication style, and we were definitely connected, father and son. But I didn't realize the extent to which he really did influence my life in a way that I was blind to for all the years that he was alive. When he was diagnosed and then when he died, we had some bedside chats for sure. When he passed, I felt complete. But then as the time passed, I realized that I was remarkably under-equipped to navigate his passing. I don't even think I actually knew what the word grieving meant when he left. And that's sort of embarrassing to say since I was 35 years old. In any case, I did a shitty job of grieving his loss. And it ultimately cost me my own mental health, midlife crisis, whatever you want to call it, almost a decade later. And that's when I put this thing called Soul Degree together. And as Soul Degree has evolved, my own understanding of myself has evolved significantly to the point where I started taking a sincere interest in subject matter or outlets that would serve me in the conversations that I'm having with men. I had a yoga certification and a certification in Buddhist meditation that was kind of my foundation upon which thinking I could springboard into doing something for men. But then I started to pursue my master's in spiritual psychology. There's a lot of talk about death and dying in there. And that pursuit was really to try to just widen my own aperture on what I knew to be this concept of what matters or what's spiritual or who is our God. The more I thought about it, the more and more I realized, like I sort of looked back and realized just how I realized there was so much I just didn't know at the time. And so I can't remember how it came to be, but I really took an interest in this idea of that dichotomy between being a birth doula versus a death doula, and knowing that it all comes full circle anyway for us at the end of our life. And what did that even mean to be an end of life doula? And so it was with that curiosity, plain and simple, that I pursued the certification, not because I necessarily wanted to be a professional doula, so to speak, or hang out a shingle as one, but I wanted to know what these conversations were and what did that mean. I had for several years volunteered with hospice, that it was following a little bit in my mom's footsteps, who's still with us today. She's done a bunch of work with hospice. So I was inspired by that. But I wondered about this doula thing. It really cracked open a whole new realm, which is not just the fact that we come and go, but the more I think about my own personal role, and I don't want to say doula, but like what has put me here on earth and put me through this certification and this understanding and exposure and interest in end of life doula work that I should be leveraging. And I think it has a lot to do with just opening up this conversation, particularly with people of our generation who are staring down the barrel at losing their own aged parents and don't have a clue as to how to enter into any given conversation about death and dying. It is sort of a taboo topic, certainly here in the West, but how do we do it with our still living but soon to be dying parents? To me, that is really ringing true for me right now.
And I
There's a
think,
lot. Yeah, please go.
I was going to say that we've talked about, I mean, we're both in our 50s, right? My parents died at a much younger age.
Yeah.
I do want to share before I jump in, you and I just met, and I shared with you that my father was 42 when he passed. He also passed of esophageal cancer.
Oh, wow.
And it was 18 months from diagnosis to death. Sometimes these conversations, two things. One is that the conversations about death, it seems to open up more real conversations. I find that when I can talk to a stranger and that they're open to having these conversations, it's just amazing what comes out of it. Like the realness that and the meaningfulness versus there are people in my life that I've known for 20, 30, 40 years, and I can't have a conversation about death and dying. They don't want to have a conversation about death and dying. And I feel like I can't get to know them because there's this piece of life that they just won't share.
Mm.
And then the other piece I wanted to say is at 50 years old, don't you feel like the generational elevator is going up a flight? like we're not in the penthouse yet, but we're pretty high up there.
Yeah, true. And I'd also like to believe, in addition to that happening with us just getting older, that there really is a rising tide of consciousness. I mean, you and I are sitting here having this conversation right now, and we probably wouldn't have been 20 years ago. And there's other people out there that are tweeting out the same information, which is fantastic and should be, particularly for us, because we don't even know what it means to handhold somebody through to the end or celebrate the fact that, yeah, life has come full. But how do we do that in such a way where people feel taken care of and honored?
Do you feel that because you've had this opportunity with your father and then went through the training, which gave you tools to open up these conversations, how has that impacted your children who are, I guess they're Gen Zers? Do you find that now that this conversation has opened up, it's easier for them to talk about it?
I think the short answer is yes, definitely. I'd like to believe that it helps all of us be occasionally reminded of the fragility of it all. Although, sadly, it's usually the loss of somebody that delivers the stark reminder of that. But my youngest son came home from college the other day and he said, "Hey, Dad, I signed up for a course next semester called Death and Dying."
That's brilliant.
I thought, okay, well, something must be rubbing off because that sure as hell wouldn't have been a class I would have taken back in the 90s.
I mean, again, is this the family? You have a very open communication style with your family, but do you feel that he's just inquisitive or that you've really laid the foundation?
I guess I don't relate to myself or my actions as laying the foundation, but certainly I have made it to be inquisitive and bring that curiosity. They're well aware of the wide spectrum of topics and conversations that get brought up with the men that I work with. They're not blind to the tough, dark, sticky stuff that gets kicked around in the process of being human, particularly as it relates to what it means these days to be a man. I have two daughters and a son, so my youngest is the boy, and Oakley, in addition to being the youngest of three, has already benefited tremendously from being that sponge. I think he also has the benefit of being the one other guy in the family.
Well, I'm the youngest of four, so I can certainly.
I was the youngest of three, and I benefited from being the younger, not the older.
And you've brought in this death topic. I also wanted to share the book here, Mark Nepo's The Book of the Awakenings. So this is one of those primary books that you use within Soul Degree. I just got introduced to it, but it is a New York bestseller. What was it about this book that you felt that you wanted to incorporate into Soul Degree and Mark's experience going through cancer?
Initially, when I picked up that book, it was in the very early days of me developing my own meditation practice, where I was at times struggling with the normal kind of, oh, I'm not doing this right, or I'm not good at this, or how do you even do this? We got into this conversation about trying to quiet your thoughts and your mind. And somebody said, oh, well, I don't do that. I read this passage every day from this book, and then I sit down and I meditate on it, which sounded like the antithesis of trying to silence the thoughts. That opened up a doorway into not just Mark's writing, which is poetic in its own way, but very thought provoking. I think his writing made it okay for me to be having some of these very intimate questions or conversations with myself. And it's ironic because I think initially I didn't pick up on the fact that he was a cancer patient, or that part of his own path as a writer was really inspired by him having his bout of cancer and near death. I think I was dead myself at the time.
You bring
In
up
my
a point, right?
Yeah.
Just taking the word death and what does death mean, right? The reason I'm saying is because I've done podcasts on divorce and death and relationships and death and people that have been laid off from a company they've worked for 30 years. That's a death. So it's not necessarily the physical. It could be, as you said, the very metaphorical process that we're going through. And the renewal. That's what I loved about the book, is that he talks about the death as a portal.
Yeah.
And moving through it and having I have a quote here from it. It says, death is not the closing of a door, but it's opening of what we cannot see.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for most people, even if they're going through a physical death or a metaphorical death, what we can't see is what causes the fear, even knowing we still need to walk through the door.
Yeah, I appreciate that reminder, because you're right. Metaphorically, we die on many different levels at different stages in our life. I was definitely dead back then. That when I think about it, um, Soul Degree is not, I didn't put it in place necessarily because I felt like people needed some place to go to deal with their problems, but we are always dealing with our own respective transitions in life. And that's very much how I tee up the program for men, is to use the time wisely to tackle what might be going on in one's life, whether they're losing loved ones or changing jobs. That in and of itself, you're right, is a form of death and rebirth. And it does happen almost every time for every guy, is that they cross through this threshold and step into a new world, many of whom never considered existed before.
And why do you feel or think people are so afraid? Even your participants, they join knowing that there's going to be some sort of letting go process. So what is the fear people have? Part of what I'm trying to do as a thanatologist, especially a digital thanatologist, is get people to talk about this death and dying because it's such a taboo topic. And how, in your workshops, on your retreats, how do you support and encourage people to have enough bravery to step through the doorway?
Mm. Well, I think some of it starts with the setup, and I am very quick to point out that Soul Degree is not set up to be the kind of retreat experience where you necessarily will come back home feeling all clean and refreshed. That's not to say that we're there flogging one another with our respective, life issues, but at the same time, I am quick to point out the importance of doing the hard work and doing it in the company of 12 other objective men who have nothing to gain or lose from sharing their story or hearing the stories of others, but everything to gain, really. And so I think that the pump, and some of the stuff that I do in advance of us getting together is absolutely designed to prime the pump, so to speak, so that when people show up on day one, hour one, we're ready to dive into the topics that are very near and dear to them, of which are always different for the next guy. It's always a pretty diverse range of topics, challenges that people have had or are currently navigating, or are just using the time away from their everyday lives and family. No disrespect to them, but using the time to clean the slate and almost start over.
And have there been other end of life doulas that are drawn to this kind of work that you've encountered?
No, not really. I haven't. I'm always pleasantly surprised at people's openness and willingness to talk about death and dying once they know that my door is wide open to the conversation. But I don't know that people put that first. I think, as I mentioned earlier, for many, in my experience, if with parents who are generally okay with their health, it's easy to remain in denial that they themselves are going to reach the end. Sometimes light bulbs go off, realizing, wow, there is no better time than the present to go shoulder up next to mom or dad or both of them and engage with them in a way that has some urgency to it. To your point, it's easy to just steer clear of that and have another cup of coffee or another cocktail or enjoy the good times while they're rolling, if you will. And that's not to say the conversation needs to rain on the parade, but yeah, it's definitely one of those things that I think really does need time and space to wade into it. It's one of the things that I always found so stark with the concept of what an end of life doula could do. It was described to me as there's the logistics, like the basic kind of a third of the pie is the affairs, the passwords, the finances, and that sort of stuff. That's a house worth getting in order prior to the transition. And then there's this another third of the pie, which is really more like health and medical related. How do you set yourself up for success with the right team and all that sort
As
of
you're
stuff?
transitioning, like that comfort care.
Or even in advance, right? And then there's this third piece, which is the more woo woo, touchy feely spiritual side that itself is a whole nother field of study prior to transitioning. When I heard about it like that, putting all of it together, it's like, how could you ever deal with all of that inside of a year or two? I thought to myself, wow, somebody who's smart, who buys into the concept of working with an end of life doula, should lock in a decade before they might even think their transition is going to happen. Because giving it a lot of time and space and breadth and being able to revisit some of these things and doing them without feeling like, oh shit, I better get to the kitchen table and talk to my son about my tombstone or whatever it is. This needs space and time. So the sooner you can start talking, the better. When my son said he's taking a class on death and dying, I thought, all right, well, 19 feels a little early, but hey, you know, if you're
Does
if
it?
you're gonna
I mean, so you might not be familiar, but I do have an app called My Final Playbook. That's exactly what we do is we talk about pre-planning. My Final Playbook is actually designed for busy professionals who just don't think about it because life will happen, right? So I say a part of living is dying. We're all going to die, but we're going to die one of three ways, either sudden and unexpected, right? So for your son, he might have experienced either friends where suicide was involved or a car accident or a natural disaster, or we might get that terminal diagnosis or condition, which is that hospice situation. Or like my father-in-law, who's 94 years old and being warehoused in a nursing home, you know, with that level of incapacitation, he's still here, but has no life left. Either way, we're going to go one of those three ways. To be able to talk about it early in our lives and put a final playbook together and have those meaningful conversations. And then, yeah, you iterate that book, right? This is what life looks like today. And this is who my executor is today. But maybe down the road, that executor ends up marrying somebody I don't love and trust. And so I need to swap executors around. Or we talk about the medical aid in dying and how that option is becoming more prevalent in different states. It's certainly available in the entire country of Canada. So the legal conversations are coming up. So for me, you know, listening to that your son is going to take this class, that's like asking a 19-year-old who hasn't had a personal finance class. I mean, I think it's at that same level. Kids graduate college and they don't know how to balance a checkbook or their bank accounts. Being able to have that conversation because they might be dealing with, maybe not for themselves, but what is that death conversation like, whether it's a peer or a parent or a grandparent? But to have the context to be able to, hey, part of living is dying and this is what's going to happen. It's incredibly empowering, I think, that he has an interest in it and then being able to share that with you.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. You say for yourself that you're built for it because you lost your folks early on. And of course, there's a lot to be said for that. Whether you're ready to be prepared for it or not, that will do it. We had a few instances in our family upbringing where suicide was prevalent and very dramatic and shocking that no doubt has rubbed off on our three kids. You know, my dad's passing was, I mean, 18 months is pretty quick, but in the scheme of things, it felt like you were watching paint dry a
Oh,
little bit. So it's not as the same thing as just the finality of somebody's, you know, one day being here and the next day not. But yeah, there's probably been a combination of things that are influencing his thinking. He also had, and I don't remember having this kind of crisis of confidence, or at least being able to pick up on it and articulate it. But that was probably 3 or 4 years ago. He saw some film on essentially how the world is burning up and we're all going to die kind of thing. And he came home from school and was immediately kind of thrown into this tailspin. Wow, I'm just a speck of sand in this massive universe. What's the point? It threw him into a major crisis of confidence in the moment. But it was like, you talk about kind of a death and rebirth. He really was shaken by this notion that, wow, do we really have any control? Like, who's driving this bus here? And why does it all matter? And why am I even here, kind of thing? And I think he's lucky to have been able to process that a little bit, pick up on the fact that it was happening, and then be able to talk about it a little bit, as opposed to, I know if it was me at 19, I would have just jammed it into my back pocket and kept trudging on like I did for another 30 or 40 years.
This has been such a meaningful conversation, Chris. I just appreciate you taking the time and also really bringing into life this conversation about death and bringing it into a mainstream conversation, that it's okay for us to start talking about it. As you know, again, in Mark's book, he talks about dying, but in understanding death so you can live more fully. And I feel like you really do embrace that conversation, you and your family. Do you have any words of wisdom or lessons learned that our listeners can take away? Just shared thoughts for yourself.
I think the thing that it's not something I've thought of other than what I'm doing with my own mom. She's 87. She's still got a lot of life in her. But when she heard that I had gone ahead and gotten this certification as an end-of-life doula, even though she had no idea what the hell that meant, she got all excited and thought, yay, I've got a doula to be with me to the end. So, of course, we've had lots of chats, but one of which I keep coming back to, which is a little bit of a moving target because you learn more and more about people the longer they're with us, is just, how does this person want to be remembered? Not even necessarily celebrated, but remembered, regardless of how many stones are turned or left unturned by people. I don't care how old or young you are. That is a conversation that anybody can have, even if they're deathly afraid of the topic about transitioning. It's also that conversation that can kick open the door to a lot of thinking and even action for people leading up to, during, or after the passing of a loved one. And that's where the rubber meets the road a little bit, is after these people that we love so much are gone, how do we continue to keep the candle burning bright? Just like you have with the picture. I mean, it's one thing to have a photo of your folks, but it's another to know that you had the conversations so that they do, in fact, know that you will be lighting that candle time and time again.
And they do. I mean, they are my guiding post for these conversations, to have the courage and the opportunity. And certainly speaking with you was a huge opportunity. So thank you again. And this will end our episode here. Appreciate your time, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. I hope this conversation inspired you to take control and plan for the inevitable to protect yourself and those you leave behind. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at digitallegacypodcast.com. Remember, life is full of surprises. What happens after you die shouldn't be. So keep your passwords safe and your playbook up to date.